Okay, Doug, we'll turn the time over to Doug Folsom for Ring Out the Year Safely.
Great, thanks, Jason. So actually what we want to talk about today isn't just being safe for the next 4 weeks of the year here, but we also want to talk about what's happened during this past year and what can we learn from it going into the new year to help us stay safer on the job. So I'm going to start out just kind of looking at what are the causes of most of the injuries that we've had, on the job in the last year. So we're going to talk about these top 5 causes of injury, being strains, slip and falls, cut, punctured, struck by or injured by an object, or absorption and ingestion. These are the top 5 causes of injury within our work comp pool for the year. So what I want to do is kind of take a look at them, who's getting hurt, and what is actually going on that causes the injury in each of these different categories. So we can learn from that, hopefully incorporate that into our training and our safety program. So first of all, this strains, 240 separate claims this year for strains. Who gets hurt? Well, if we look at this just based on length of employment, it's folks in their first 10 years of employment. And the thing that's really interesting, you look at that first year, that first bar there is less than 1 year. So these are folks that haven't even been a whole year yet. And even though it's not the highest frequency, that only represents people employed for less than a year, whereas these other bars represent, 4 years or 5 years or more. So really that is your highest risk area right there, is with your new employees. But even looking beyond that first 10 years of employment, we're much greater risk of injury during that entire time. We look at age of people who are injured, we can see this graph. It kind of looks like it goes up, until you hit about this 36 to 45 range is kind of where it peaks. And I would say most of us working for local governments in Utah are probably in this age range of 26 to 40, 55. And so, of course, that's where we're seeing this frequency happen. But there are a couple of these categories where we see some interesting trends that we can learn from based on the age as well. When looking at strains, we find that 40% in 2016, the injuries that have happened so far this year, 40% of those injuries are from pushing, pulling, or lifting. And so that's not a majority, but it's most of where that's coming from. And so that's some basic, ergonomics, back safety that we talk about quite a bit. Also, we throw in there twisting and bending, and that goes right in that same category of training too. So between lifting, pulling, twisting, and bending, we've got over 50% of all those strain injuries. An interesting category or area is this restraining a person, fighting. You'll see this a couple times in the different categories as we go through here. That usually has to do with law enforcement. First responders, a lot of law enforcement, some medical, people who work in maybe some mental health facilities. Sometimes we see this as well. But the vast majority of those are police officers dealing with unruly individuals that don't want to cooperate. Physical fitness training. We actually, if you are a first responder, police and fire, lots of times we may find you actually working on your fitness on the clock, and therefore sometimes those injuries will fall under work comp. And so we see about 7% of our strains come from actual physical fitness training. Jumping down, okay? Everybody goes around and jumps down all day, don't they? This generally is referring to people, getting down off of something, jumping down, missing the bottom step on the stairs, jumping down off a ladder, jumping down off of a piece of equipment. So about 5% of our strains come from, improperly dismounting a piece of equipment or something like that. Uneven surfaces also results in a lot of strains. People walking out on the ground where maybe they step into a ditch or a pothole or something unexpectedly, and they get some strains from that. Running, 3%. Again, that kind of, you would think might fall in that physical fitness training. Sometimes it's not just training though. People may just be running as part of the job and they pull a muscle while they're running. Also, motor vehicle accidents and handling animals each have about 2% of our total strains associated with those as well. So what can we do about these? First of all, proper lifting techniques. I mentioned ergonomics, back safety. So, proper lifting techniques, good posture, those are things we've talked about in trainings in the past that are going to be very helpful in preventing these strains, especially that 51% that falls into the lifting, pushing, pulling, twisting, bending. Also warm up, and I think this is something we overlook quite a bit. We get into our work, we start the day, or we know we're going to be doing something physical, and we don't take a minute to get our body warmed up, especially when it's cold outside, but it can happen year-round. It's important to warm up before we start really physically exerting ourselves. Staying fit is also an important thing that we can do to help prevent these injuries from sprains and strains, and staying loose, maybe having some stretching exercises can help as well. That can help us warm up as well as help our muscles stay loose. Another thing that's really important to do is listen to your body. If it hurts for a reason. It's trying to tell you something. So make sure you listen to your body and react to what it's telling you. Don't just keep pushing yourself beyond, when your muscles start to tell you that they hurt or they're getting really tired, because then you're much more susceptible to injury. Don't overdo it. And lots of times we overdo it at home or off the clock, and then we come to work, with our muscles in kind of a worn out state already. And then that makes it easier for us to get injured on the job as well. Don't be afraid to ask for help. If the task is large, help lifting something is a good thing to do, and looking for mechanical assist devices and tools is also a very important thing to do, rather than always using your back as that lever to pick things up. So that's some ideas on things we can do, and these are all parts of training that we've done in the past. I want you to think about that as we go through here. Nothing here is new. This is a compilation of a lot of things that we've talked about on a regular basis. The second category where we see the most injuries in is slips and falls. And so who's slipping and falling? Again, we look at the employees that are newer. That impressively, that first year of employment has a much higher rate of slip and falls. I think there was 189 slip and fall claims that we looked at here. We've got about 30 of them are people who've worked for us less than a year, for just a matter of months. And so that's a pretty good chunk of them just in that first year. But again, that first 10 years of employment were much more susceptible. Now, here's an interesting one. We look at the age of people who are injured from falls, and this graph almost goes straight up. Each age category we go up, we become more susceptible to injury from falls. We look at that, 18 to 25 group, and it's almost nothing. That's the indestructible phase. We fall down then, and it doesn't really seem to hurt us usually. But unfortunately, the habits we develop during that period come back to haunt us later on. So it's important to practice good safety, even when we're in that indestructible phase, because we can get hurt, and the bad habits will hurt us later on. Every age category older we get, the more severe the injuries are likely to be if we do fall. So, when you're getting like me and we're getting, to the top end of that middle age area there, you want to make sure you're extra careful more and more all the time to make sure that we don't fall. So how are these falls happening? This one isn't really a surprise to us. Maybe it's a surprise to some of you, but we see a ton of really serious accidents when it comes to slipping and falling on snow and ice. And a lot of rotator cuffs get torn when people fall down, putting your arms back, trying to catch yourself when you fall. And we see, your head may get hit, all sorts of things, but we see really serious injuries on snow and ice. Now, here's the thing. We got snow and ice here, 4 months of the year. Starting right now, here's the time where it starts. We got 22% of all of our slip and falls happening on snow and ice. So 22% of these slip and falls are happening during the 3 or 4 months of the winter season. That tells me that during the next 3 months or so, almost all of our slip and fall injuries are going to be because of the snow and ice. you know, and so that's something that we really need to be aware of. It's something you've got to take some precautions for, maybe do some training on, but we got to be really careful. It's Utah, folks. We know it snows. We know it's cold. It gets icy. You know, we should be prepared, you know, for these conditions. And so really be careful out there, especially in these winter months with the slips and falls. Dismounting equipment, 13% of our slip and falls, you know, climbing down off of the backhoe, off of the track hoe or whatever piece of equipment. So 3 points of contact, you know, that's an important one. We see a lot of injuries there. Uneven surfaces, walking on ground, again, stepping in a hole or a ditch or, you know, something uneven, you know, in the work area there results in a lot of trip and falls. And slip and trip hazards just in general, cords on the floor, tools left on the ground or boxes or things like that. Another 13% of our slip and falls happen from that kind of condition. Again, the first responders, law enforcement, about 6% of our slip and falls happen while we're trying to chase somebody down. 4% happen falling on stairs. And of course, stairs are kind of scary. You know, make sure that we're taking care on the stairs. We'll talk in a second about some of the things we can do. And ladder safety, 3% of our falls off of ladders. Medical events, also 3% of our falls. Someone who just, you know, passes out for a medical reason and they fall and hurt themselves from the fall. So what can we do? Number one, especially right now, this time of year, proper footwear. Make sure that depending on your work conditions, whether you're indoors or outdoors, whatever it is, you know, we need to evaluate that. Make sure you have the proper footwear. And when we're talking about snow and ice, having your work boot with the Vibram soles on it may not be, you know, the best thing for working outside in the wintertime. There's soles that we can get, boots with special soles or overshoes that you can get that go on over your boot to give you a different sole that can give you really good traction on snow and ice. And I really encourage you to look at those options, especially for employees that are working outdoors. Lots of us are going indoors and outdoors, so you may need to be careful about what you put on the bottom of your feet so you don't damage floors when you come inside. That really gives some consideration to your footwear during the winter, stuff that's really going to grab a hold of that snow and ice. Maintain your center of gravity. Of course, when we're walking on a slippery surface, you want to take little steps. You know, keep that center of gravity right underneath you. If you take big, long strides or you push out hard or try to stop hard when you're on those surfaces, that's when you're going to slip and fall. So maintain your center of gravity by taking cautious, smaller steps on those slippery conditions. Maintain 3 points of contact, especially mounting and dismounting equipment, stairs, ladders. Remember that 3 point of contact rule. Don't block your vision. When you're walking and you're carrying stuff in front of you, you may not be able to see the ground real well, and you're going to, you know, hit those trip hazards or whatever. So make sure you can see where you're going, know your surroundings, proper ladder safety. I mean, we see just a few of these. You know, I think it was 3% of these claims from falling off of ladders, but we've had some really serious accidents, people falling off ladders and having just career-ending, debilitating injuries, almost, you know, life-ending events falling off of ladders. So make sure you use proper ladder safety. When you're on the stairs, use those handrails. You know, we have to have those handrails on stairs for a reason. You know, and that's kind of one way you can, you know, somewhat maintain that 3 points of contact, even going up and down stairs. Make sure you have, you know, at least one hand on that rail as you're going up and down, because if you know, usually we don't fall, but if you do, that's a scary place to fall. We need to have a program in place for identifying and correcting hazards. So we've talked about this quite a bit too, having your safety audits where you're looking around your facilities, looking for things that are dangerous, and not just identifying them, but making sure we have a program in place to correct those as well. The third category where we seem to get hurt a lot is cuts and punctures. And, you know, there's about 100 injuries so far this year from cut and punctures. Again, look at that first year. The first year has almost the same frequency as years 1 through 4. And of course, by frequency, you're looking at the black line with the dots in it. That's the number of claims. So we have like 26, you know, people getting cut or punctured in that first year of employment compared to, looks like about 26 or 28, you know, in that second group, which is 1 to 4 years. And so really we look at those first 10 years of employment, but especially that first year of employment, make sure we're training people and observing how they work so we can help them work safe. Here's a bell curve, almost looks like a bell curve here, this inverted curve. So again, you know, younger, we don't see a lot of people in that younger category, but a fair amount when you get that 18 to 25, and then 26 to 46, you know, we see that highest frequency. Again, that's the age that most of us are in this workforce. So we see those injuries happening there. What do we do about it? Well, these things are happening, you know, because of sharp edges. 25% of these cut and punctures happen on an edge of some sort. It could be something on a tool. It could be something on the edge of a workbench. It could be something overhead, you know, that's got a sharp edge on it. Lots of times you'll see an edge and it looks really sharp, or there'll be a burr on something and you think, man, I could get cut on that real easy, or you know, I could, you know, that burr could snag me real easy. And we see those things. We need to find a way to correct them, you know, make sure that we don't just leave them there, become aware of them, but we want to fix them. About 12% of our cut and punctures come from a blade, a utility knife or some other knife that we're using to cut things with, and that's one that's really preventable. Needle sticks is another 12%, especially first responders, police, and fire, and people working in medical environments. But it could be anybody. You could, you know, come across the needle cleaning up the park or whatever, but needle sticks is a real common one that we see. Power tools, 9% of our cut and punctures come while using a power tool. You think about that's kind of scary. You know, one I saw, I think there's about 3 or 4 of them, and I thought, am I reading the same claim over and over? As I was looking at these, it was a circular saw. I had employees who were using a circular saw, like a skill saw, and they, you know, the saw kicked back, or for whatever reason they pulled it out, and they went to set it down or rest it against their leg, and the guard hadn't retracted, and they stuck that blade right into their leg. And I saw this multiple times, the same thing, you know, so making sure that, you know, we're got machine guarding in place on our tools and making sure that it's working properly. I mean, that's just a real, you know, that's a pucker. And I think about, you know, sticking a circular saw blade in my thigh. So, you know, we want to make sure that we're safe on those things. Cutting with a hand tool, you know, is another 8%. Assault, these are mostly bites. Human bites. And actually the interesting thing is we do see quite a bit of first responders, paramedics and police officers getting bit, but we also see a lot of people working in some of these medical health facilities, mental health facilities getting bit as well. So that's something to think about, prevention there. Dog bites, about 7%. Interesting, half of these dog bites were canine handlers getting bit by their own dog. And the other half are, you know, people, you know, getting bit by a dog they weren't familiar with. Step on a shark, you know, stepping on nails and screws, you know, so is another 4% of these cut and punctures. So how do we protect ourselves? Number one, you got to be doing those safety audits. You got to be looking around your facilities, looking for those sharp edges, you know, where there's a sharp edge or a burr, and then make sure that we correct those deficiencies when we see them. If you're using a blade to cut, make sure it's a sharp blade. If you use a dull blade, it gets hung up, and then you pull harder, and then it breaks free, and it kind of jerks, and then, you know, you can wind up, you know, coming into contact with that blade as it jerks loose a lot easier. So if you've got a nice sharp blade, it cuts easy. You know, it's easier to control and handle. And so use a sharp blade. Cut away from your body. We see a lot of these where, you know, you're holding something and then you cut and you're cutting towards your hand. A bunch of these injuries where we're cutting our hand with the blade because we're cutting towards ourselves. Make sure you cut away from your body, not into your body. Make sure you're using proper PPE, whether that's a glove, you know, that is appropriate for the work that you're doing, that maybe gives some cut resistance. A boot, if you're wearing a safety shoe, it's going to have some protection against that nail coming through your shoe and puncturing your foot. Hard hats also. We had quite a few of these situations where people, for example, were working around a backhoe or some heavy equipment, and they got hit by the heavy equipment, either by, you know, with the shovel or some other part of the equipment as it was moving around. And you want to make sure that you've got your head protected, especially in those situations. So hard hats, Really important to make sure you need those where they're needed. Machine guarding, I mentioned, the circular saw with the guards not retracting. We see a lot of these on grinders, miter saws, circular saws, table saws, all sorts of things where the guards get taken off and they're just not even there. Or if they're there, they're kind of jammed up and they're not working properly. Those guards exist for a really good reason. That's to keep you from cutting your hands off or sticking blades into yourself. And so let's make sure that we've got those guards working and in place. Another one I saw quite a bit was chainsaws. I saw 2 or 3 claims for people who stuck a chainsaw into their leg or into their knee. And so again, make sure you have the right kind of chaps on. If you're using a shap, excuse me, if you're using a chainsaw, to make sure you have some protection if that chain should, get too close to your leg. Lots of these claims I see, the tool kicks back, the chainsaw or the circular saw gets bound up a little bit, kicks back, and then comes into your hand or into your leg. So really important to make sure we got PPE. Also may look at some training on how to use those tools to avoid, that kickback as well. Sharps containers. We see a lot of needle sticks, especially with first responders, but even others that may come into contact, be around hypodermic needles. We want to make sure that not just needles, but blades, your utility knife blades or razor blades that you may be using for different things, that they get disposed of in a container where they're not going to cut somebody afterwards. I saw a few claims for people who were getting cut through a garbage bag. And this is something we talk about like in our bloodborne pathogen training, where, make sure that we dispose of things properly so that they're not a hazard to people later on who may handle the garbage or whatever. Saw several claims where someone was carrying the garbage out and they were holding up underneath the bag and something, poked through the bag and cut them. So make sure that we are disposing of sharp objects, especially blades and needles, in an approved sharps container to help prevent those types of exposures. Again, make sure you have procedures for exactly those kind of things. If you're in a job where you've got a high risk for needle sticks or something, make sure that your training and your procedures for avoiding needle sticks and proper disposal of the needles and handling of the needles and things like that, that you've gone over those to make sure that you can keep yourself safe. That's kind of a scary thing. Not so much that needle sticks are such a scary injury in and of themselves, but the potential infectious exposures are what's really scary there. Who gets struck? Okay, so the next category is hit and struck by an object. Again, that first year, look how high the frequency is just for those first few months of employment compared to everything else. So again, be working carefully with your new employees to make sure they have proper training. Again, we see this peak right here, in the 30s to 40s age range where we are. What's happening? Fights, again, this is a first responder, law enforcement thing where, someone's unruly, not participating, they wind up punching somebody. And so we see 27% of our struck or injured by a result from people resisting arrest and things like that. Objects falling, from a height, 12% of those. Motor vehicle accidents, almost 10% of our struck and injured by. Struck by a tool, 5%. Moving furniture, it was kind of interesting. I saw so many of these where we're jamming our hands against a door frame or something while we're moving a piece of furniture. Heavy equipment, struck or injured by, again, that hard hat, working around equipment, getting hit by parts of a loader or backhoe or things like that. We need to make sure we're reviewing our safety procedures, working around heavy equipment, and objects getting in the eye. Also 4%, and that's a real basic one. We know what we should be doing, for those things. Safety glasses, again, proper PPE. Struck and injured by, what do we do to protect ourselves? The highest frequency there with law enforcement. What are some things we can do? Review your policies and procedures, your use of force. Maybe some of these incidents can be prevented by, using an electronic control device, a taser or something, rather than mixing it up hand to hand with folks. And I'm sure we try to avoid those situations as much as possible. Securing your storage. A lot of these incidents where something's falling, it's falling off a trailer or off a truck. Make sure those loads are secured. Make sure things on your shelves are secured. Defensive driving and seatbelt use, those MVAs, those motor vehicle accidents. Make sure that you are protecting yourself from other people's mistakes make sure you wear that seatbelt. Proper PPE, you know, again, safety glasses, keep those things out of your eyes, you know, hard hats and other things that we've talked about. Very important to make sure you identify the proper PPE. The final category where we see a lot of injuries occurring, there's about 50 injuries so far this year where we have an absorption or an ingestion, or I guess we include with that inhalation also of an injury. And actually this is like one area where we don't see that really super high frequency on that first year employee. You know, we see the highest frequency in the 5 to 9 years on this one, and these are situations where we may not be coming into contact with some of these hazards until we have a little more experience on the job, just because of the nature of these hazards. But still very important to make sure we understand and protect ourselves. Again, that same age range where we're most likely to be injured. So if how do we get these? Well, the most frequent one, 69%, almost 70% of these happen because of a potential exposure to an infection. You know, whether that's a disease or some infectious materials that we may have come into contact with. A real common one with these, you know, are like first responders transport a patient, and then they later on find out that they had meningitis or something like that, or tuberculosis. And so then we want to, you know, make sure we have some follow-up to make sure that there wasn't any contagion there of that infection. So that's the most common one, but it's still 11% of these are chemical exposures, 7% are smoke inhalation, 4% is a work byproduct, for example, inhaling fumes from welding or things like that. Exposure to allergens is 4%, as is hypothermia or heat exhaustion, hot and cold exposures are another 4%. So what can we do with these? Again, proper PPE, whether that's, you know, protecting the respiratory system or protecting yourself from other types of exposures, you know, bloodborne pathogen training. And it doesn't just go for first responders. We should all understand the potential risks associated with coming into contact with potentially infectious materials, with people's body fluids or blood. It's any one of us could come into contact with blood in our work environment if somebody gets injured. So we really need to understand those hazards. Hazard communication training. Make sure you know the hazards associated with chemicals that you're handling. What's the PPE and what are the procedures to protect yourself from chemical exposure? And really, if you've got, you know, in a situation where there's a potential infectious material or a hazardous chemical or something, and the chances are you maybe got it on your hands, you know, then make sure you're not doing hands to face. Don't rub your eyes, pick your nose, pick your teeth, smoke, drink, whatever, you know, if there's potential that you have infectious materials on your hands. So be really careful about that. Just to wrap this up, in summary, I would say, because this is all training that we've done during the year, and we do these trainings because this is how we're getting hurt. And so we need to keep addressing these things. So make sure we're doing that training. But as important as the training is, make sure we're implementing the training. We can train till we're blue in the face, and we don't prevent any injuries from happening just by training. We only prevent injuries when we take the training and we implement it. And so make sure that training is being implemented, and supervisors out there, you know, part of your responsibility is to enforce that training as well. So make sure we're implementing the training, putting it to work, and make sure that we're enforcing it. If we see someone not using the training that they've been taught, we need to correct and make sure we do that. What kind of accidents have you had this last year in your organization? You should be looking at that right now and kind of work that into your training plan for 2017, you know, so that you can plan your training for the next year. Don't just totally rely on what the trust does. You may identify other training needs that aren't in our training schedule. And so make sure you're working that into your plan. And once you've done that, repeat steps 1, 2, and 3. Train, implement the training, and make sure you're enforcing that training. Jason, do we have any questions yet so far?
I don't have any questions in on the chat box or the Q&A box, so I would like, folks, if you've got some questions, go ahead and type those in. I'll come up with some canned questions, but Doug's done such a great job of covering this subject that I don't think anybody has any questions. I appreciate it, Doug. Doug's done a great job here talking about the day-to-day, these are the things. I told him in between sessions here, about the cringe factor that I had as he talks about setting a circular saw on your leg and having it cut your leg.
Sticking a chainsaw on your knee.
Yeah, those type of things. And we see these on a daily basis as we watch the claims come in and see that, and we get the cringe factor, and we've taken it upon ourselves to share that with you as much as we possibly can, partially to give you a good dose of fear, but more than anything, to give you a real kick to go and do something about it, to make sure that doesn't happen on your shift, that doesn't happen to you. So I'm just looking here. I'm not seeing any questions coming in. Brett, got anything to add?
There is a question on the TAP application in the Q&A box.
Good question. Jane asked about the TAP application. We'll talk about that a little more in the next webinar. January 15th is the drop dead date for the TAP application. We would love to have those in a long time ahead of that, if we could. We've got we're bumping up against 20 of those in so far, and but we expect to have over 100 of those, and it takes us a little while to get through and process each one of those applications. So if you've got your stuff done, turn it into us now, and so we can get that process, get you to check out, get you the discounting and those types of things. So we're excited to wrap up this year and see how many of you have added that to your hat, that feather to your cap, to receive the TAP award, and also the financial incentives as well. So good question. Okay, Doug, final word.
Train, implement, enforce. Make sure we do it. Let's stay safe. Let's have a great 2017. Let's have fewer injuries this year than last year. Let's not have any injuries. How would that be, Jason, if we had no injuries?
I would like that. I would like to be laid off because nobody had an injury.
That'd be gratitude.
It would be awesome. Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Doug. I appreciate your time and attention on this. He spent a lot of days diving through the claims data and to put this great material together. So thank you much, Doug. I appreciate it, and we will catch you again soon. So everybody go out and have a safe day.